Welcome to the Card Manager Overview Information Session. This session is designed exclusively for the Card Manager, which is an employee that currently holds a department or service center P-card to procure general and travel business expenses. You are invited based on your status as an active Card Manager. If you are a card holder, in other words, if you have an individual card, please be sure to review the Card Holder Overview session posted at the P-card website, which includes specific criteria for that role. P-card information sessions are offered periodically to select audiences to offer information updates. This session will include a few detailed slides, then a brief demo. Resources for this session include job aids and other materials posted at the P-card website. Regarding the P-card website, we recommend bookmarking this page for future use. All information covered in the Card Manager Overview is available at the P-card website, including information about the card you hold and what you can or cannot purchase with a P-card. You'll find processing support job aids. You'll also find bank contact information for reporting fraud or lost cards, along with dispute guidance. There's news and much more. This session includes a review of the Card Manager role and card types issued to a Card Manager. We'll be identifying the Card Manager responsibilities, and we'll introduce the process in Workday to expense the transactions you make with the P-card. As a reminder, this session is just an overview, so you should refer to the P-card website, policy, and available job aids and training for more specific guidance. So let's start with the role and responsibilities of a Card Manager. It is important to note that the term Card Manager is exclusive to employees who are assigned permanent custody of a department or service center P-card. The role should not be confused with a card holder who is issued an individual card. The department card is issued for the procurement of goods and services and sometimes travel expenses necessary to conduct university business and may be shared with other employees in the unit. The Service Center card is issued for similar purchases but confined to use within the Service Center staff only. The standard limit for the department card is $5,000 per transaction and effective January 1st, $20,000 per cycle, while the Service Center card is set with higher limits at $7,500 per transaction and $50,000 per cycle. Some cards may be issued with lower or higher limits as authorized by your unit. Lastly, the card is embossed with a unit or program name. Responsibilities of a Card Manager include, but are not limited to, reviewing the P-card policy and completing required training to ensure use of the P-card is appropriate and in compliance with university policies. You are also responsible for making appropriate business purchases for the unit. When sharing the P-card with P-card users, you are required to make sure the tracking log is used for release of the card to every card user. Make sure the card user understands what purchases are restricted. Make sure the card user understands the tax exemption status and obligations. Remind the card user to return the card in a timely manner along with the itemized receipt. Also, advise the card user of the precautions that should be taken for the card security while in their possession. As a Card Manager, you are also responsible for keeping the P-card in a secure place. Don't share the full account number through email and immediately report lost, stolen cards, or fraud. Lastly, starting January 7th, you are responsible for reassigning travel transactions and expensing non-travel transactions in Workday. Any transaction made on or after December 25th will be routed to Workday to begin these processes. So let's move on to the process with Workday. In current state, you initiate an e-request before you make a purchase. For shared use, you validate that the P-card user has a PR number before releasing the card via the tracking log, and you or the card user then makes the purchase. After the purchase is made, you collect and submit the receipts to the unit to reallocate and approve transactions by the designated deadline. In future state, authority to use the card is as follows. Authority to use the P-card for travel expenses requires an approved spend authorization number in advance of purchase, noting that airfare is not permitted on the P-card and should be procured through the contracted travel agency. Authority to use the department card does not require system approval for general business expenses, but should be for legitimate business purposes, noting current spend restrictions may merit documented approval before use. The authority to use the Service Center card requires a requisition using the requisition type of key card transaction. This should be done in advance of the purchase for general business expenses. Card managers must have card users complete the tracking log before releasing the P card. The card manager also has the authority to deny release of the P card to individuals as appropriate. If you have not routinely used the tracking log to record shared use in the past, you will need to change that pattern in order to complete your responsibilities associated with reassigning and expensing transactions charged to the card you manage. In current state, there is only one tracking log that serves to record any transaction made by P card users. However, in future state, there are two tracking logs, one to record non-travel transactions and the other for travel transactions. Although it is not required for you as the card manager to add your own transactions to the log, it might be helpful with the reassignment and/or expensing of P card transactions in Workday. Here's a quick peek at the tracking log for non-travel transactions. The forms were designed differently to easily distinguish the difference. This log is vertically formatted as a PDF file that can be printed to capture the required signatures from the card user. In addition, the work tags, formerly known as chart field, and business purpose are required. And here's the tracking log for travel transactions. This log is horizontally formatted as a PDF file that can be printed to capture the required signatures from the card user. In addition, the spend authorization, formerly known as the T number, is required. Before we move to live demos, let's walk through the process for the variety of purchases made with your card, the cards you manage. The first example is for a department or service center card where the card manager makes the purchase on behalf of the unit. We'll start with the card manager makes an appropriate business purchase, noting again that if it is a service center card being used, a requisition is required before the purchase is made. Next, you'll scan a copy of the itemized receipt. You'll want to store the scanned file in a location to easily access for the expense report. Within 7 to 10 business days of the purchase receipt date, you must create an expense report in Workday for that transaction. After the expense report is submitted, your unit will approve the transaction in Workday. The second example is for a Department of Service Center card where the card user makes the purchase for his or herself. We'll start with the card user signing out the card on the non-travel tracking log, and they make an appropriate business purchase. Then the card manager collects the card and itemized receipt, scans an electronic copy. Within 7 to 10 business days of the purchase date, you as the card manager must create an expense report in Workday for that transaction. Again, after the expense report is submitted, your unit will approve the transaction in Workday. The third example is for a Department of Service Center card where the card manager makes a travel purchase on behalf of the traveler, for example, for registration. You'll start with making an appropriate business purchase for the traveler. You'll scan an electronic copy of the itemized receipt, and you'll provide a copy of it to the traveler by email for his or her expense report. Within a week of that transaction date, you as the card manager must reassign the transaction in Workday to the traveler. Then the traveler will create their own expense report, uploading the electronic copy of the receipt. After the expense report is submitted, the unit will approve the transaction in Workday. The fourth and final example is for a travel expense where the card user, also known as the traveler, makes his or her own travel purchase. Again, we'll use the example registration. The traveler signs out the card on the travel tracking log and then makes the appropriate business travel purchase. Then the card manager collects the card and itemized receipt and scans an electronic copy of the itemized receipt to provide to the traveler by email for his or her expense report. Again, within a week of that transaction date, you, the card manager, will reassign that transaction in Workday to the traveler. And then the traveler will create their own expense report, uploading the electronic copy of the receipt. After the expense report is submitted, the unit will approve the transaction in Workday. Let's talk about scanning the receipt. One option is to place the receipt on your local copier and scan to your email address. This will create a PDF image of your receipt that you can store. Another option is to install an app on your mobile device for scanning the receipts. Workday has a mobile app you can consider, which requires some setup before use. Make sure the scanned image of your receipt is readable for audit review, and name the scan file something easy to identify when you're ready to upload into Workday. For example, add the merchant name and transaction date to the file name. If you need assistance with scanning your receipt, please see your service center. So now that we've covered the basic steps, let's do a quick demo of the reassignment of a travel transaction. Before we begin, we will need to make sure we have the necessary documentation to ensure reassignment is made appropriately. We note that we have pulled the travel transaction tracking log and have identified a transaction made by a traveler for $425 to the American Glaucoma Society. We already sent the traveler a copy of the receipt after they returned the card, so we just need to make sure we reassign this transaction to that traveler to complete her own expense report. So let's log into Workday to begin the process. Noting we are in a test environment with real P-card data, thus we will be selecting an actual card manager's transaction for our demo. In Workday, we're going to start off by entering reassign expense credit card transactions in the search bar, and then click enter. This takes you to the reassign expense credit card transaction filter page. Here, you'll apply the applicable filters to narrow your output results. For the purpose of our demo, we'll simply leave the defaults and use the worker credit card field and select all to display the cards assigned to the card manager. Next, we'll select the card referenced on the tracking log, in this case, card 9918. And then we'll click OK. This will now take you to the Reassign Transactions to Assignee page. A table will appear with all the transactions made against this card that have not been expensed. Remember, we are only focused on travel transactions for reassignment. All other transactions will not be reassigned since you will be creating the expense report yourself. So let's scroll through the list to find the transaction noted on our travel tracking log. In this case, we're looking for $425 to the American Glaucoma Society. You can scroll through the list or use the sorting filter to locate that specific transaction. In some cases, the merchant name may not populate in the table, so we'll need to scroll and sort by the amount and dates. Or you can click on the More Actions magnifying glass to confirm the merchant name and other details. Next, refer to your tracking log to identify the traveler to which the transactions will be reassigned in order that she can create her expense report. In this case, Marie Peterson signed off the P card to purchase a conference registration fee associated with her spend authorization number. In the new expense payee column, click the X to delete your name and enter the name or employee ID of the traveler to whom you are reassigning the travel transaction. Select the appropriate match, and then click OK, and then click Done. Reminder, excuse me, as a reminder, this transaction will remain in your list until Marie Peterson has processed her expense report. This concludes the reassignment demo. Let's return to our slide deck. Now we're going to do a quick live demo of the expense report process. Before we begin, we will need to make sure that we have the necessary documentation to ensure we are expensing the transaction appropriately. We note that we've pulled the non-travel transaction tracking log and have identified a transaction made by a P-card user for $510.60 to preferred copy editing. Next, we'll make sure the receipt is scanned and electronically stored. In this case, we're peeking into our K drive to make sure we have the receipt to match the entry on our tracking log. Upon finding the receipt, we note that we took careful effort to name and date the receipt for ease of selection in Workday. Once we open the receipt, we make note that there should be a transaction to preferred copy editing for $510.60. Next, we'll log back into Workday to begin the process. In Workday, we're going to enter Create Expense Report in the search bar and click Enter. Search results will offer different expense report options, but we're going to select Create Expense Report. This will take you to the expense report information entry page. There are multiple fields that will be pre-populated, for example, company and expense report date. And if you scroll down, you'll see work tags, for example, cost center or balancing unit. These are what were previously referred to as chart fields. All pre-populated items are for your unique setup based on the unit you are employed. If you scroll down a little further, credit card transactions should appear. For this brief demo, we are focusing on one transaction, but keep in mind that multiple non-travel transactions can be selected and batched as one expense report. For this demo, we're looking for the transaction to preferred copy editing for $510.60. You can either scroll through the list or use the sorting filter to locate that specific transaction. You'll select the transaction, and we'll scroll back to the top to complete a few required fields. Since this is a non-travel transaction, we will leave the default radio selection called Create New Expense Report. Then we must enter a memo. This should be a unique reference memo for the transaction or batch of transactions. So let's type in Weekly P-Card Expense Report for card 9981, and let's put today's date. Lastly, we'll select a business purpose. Remember, since this is non-travel, the only selection is non-travel. You can click on the list of options or key in the term if you know it. In the work tag section, we're going to leave the defaults and not make any changes here. We'll scroll back down to the credit card transaction section, and we note that the transaction we've selected is checked, and we're going to click OK. This moves the process into the expense line entry page, noting that the selected transaction will appear on the left side as an expense line. If we were batching multiple transactions, all selected transactions will be listed here. Let's continue the process by attaching the transaction receipt. You can either drag or drop the file or upload by selecting the file from its stored location. Once it loads, you'll see that multiple attachments can be added for this expense line, if applicable. Also, an optional comment can be added to describe the contents of the attachment. Let's just call this attachment Editing Receipt. Next, we'll enter the expense item, either key in or select from the non-travel options. In this case, we'll key in printing and copying to find our selection. You can also search by group or category. Again, remember, non-travel group selections only. In the memo, add a general description of the purchase. We're going to peek at the receipt to get an idea of what was purchased and enter copy editing for manual. Next, we'll enter the appropriate work tags for the transaction. This is where you'll change or overwrite the default content, either key in or select from work tag options. If you're not sure what is appropriate to change, see your fiscal office for guidance. The final stage of entry is under item details on the right side of the expense line page. We'll first enter the business reason. Although not labeled as such, this is where you must enter the purpose and use of this purchase. Let's enter copying editing for special project. For Service Center cards only, you will enter your requisition number here. And if the transaction needs itemized, for example, to separate tax or alcohol, click the Add button to itemize the transaction. Be sure to check the box to indicate receipt was included. We'll scroll a little further down to enter any applicable comments. Let's enter supplier in a state that is not tax exempt and click Submit. Or save for later if more work is needed. If you notice alerts or errors, click on the alert pop-up to view. Most are warnings and will not prevent submission unless it's required. Upon submission, the expense report will now route to your unit's approvers. If there are issues with the entry, the approver may send back for edits or approve to complete the expense report process. This concludes our demo. Let's return to the slide deck. Lastly, we need to remind the card manager of deadlines for reassigning and expensing P-card transactions. Due to IRS rules, all expense reports must be processed in a timely manner. The university is setting a turnaround standard of 7 to 10 days from the transaction date. Thus, all travel transactions must be reassigned to the traveler within a timely manner, at least weekly, to permit expensing. Further, to ensure that all transactions are expensed timely, the unit is expected to monitor card managers' transactions that have not been expensed. In addition, the P-card office will be monitoring transactions and will route monthly reporting of unexpensed transactions to each unit's SFO. If questions arise after go live, consider the following options for support. That concludes the card manager overview and demo.